The jungle air was thick with humidity and the smell of gunpowder. It was the kind of heat that made your uniform stick to your skin, made every breath feel like you were inhaling steam. Harold Moon pressed his body against the rough bark of what used to be a coconut palm, now reduced to splinters by days of relentless combat. Somewhere in front of him, maybe 50 paces away, a Japanese machine gun kept spitting bullets into the foliage, shredding leaves and branches with mechanical precision. Moon had been stuck in this exact position for what felt like forever, watching the same deadly dance play out over and over again. This was Biak Island in the spring of 1944, a tiny piece of coral and jungle in the Dutch East Indies that most Americans had never heard of and would probably never think about again. But for the men of the 41st Infantry Division, it had become their entire world. A world where every cave hid an enemy, where every rock formation could be concealing a machine gun nest, and where the normal rules of warfare seemed to have been thrown out the window. The Japanese weren't fighting like armies were supposed to fight. They weren't holding lines that you could break through or positions that you could flank. They had burrowed into the island itself, turning natural coral formations into fortresses that swallowed up American lives like some kind of hungry beast. Moon watched as his sergeant made another attempt at the bunker. The sergeant was a good soldier, did everything by the manual, and right now the manual said you use fragmentation grenades against enemy positions. The sergeant pulled the pin, counted like he'd been taught, and sent the grenade spinning through the humid air toward that narrow opening in the coral where the machine gun was firing from. For a moment, it looked like it might work, but then physics took over. The grenade hit the rough coral surface, bounced like a rubber ball, and came tumbling back down the slope. Everyone hit the dirt. The explosion was loud but ultimately meaningless, just another crater in ground that was already torn to pieces. Moon had been counting. That was the 11th grenade thrown at this particular bunker since breakfast, and not a single one had made it inside. The problem was obvious if you thought about it, but apparently nobody in charge was thinking about it. The grenades they were using were designed for a different kind of war. They were made for European battlefields, for throwing into trenches or at soldiers in the open. They were relatively light, round, and designed to bounce and roll before exploding, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. But here in the Pacific, fighting an enemy that had dug themselves into solid coral, those same characteristics were getting Americans killed. The division had been on Biak for almost a week now, and the progress could be measured in yards, not miles. Every morning brought new orders to advance, and every evening brought new casualty reports that made those orders seem like cruel jokes. The math was brutally simple. The Japanese had created roughly 200 of these fortified positions across the island, and at the rate the Americans were losing men trying to take each one, the entire division would be bled white before they reached their objectives. Supply officers were already rationing grenades because they were going through them faster than the ships could bring new ones. Some squads were down to just a handful of explosives, being told to use their rifles and save the grenades for when they absolutely needed them. But rifles don't kill men hiding behind 3 feet of coral rock. Harold Moon wasn't anyone special. He hadn't gone to West Point, hadn't even finished high school back in Iowa. He was just another farm kid who'd gotten a letter from Uncle Sam telling him it was time to serve. Before the war, his biggest concerns had been weather patterns and crop prices. He knew how to milk cows, fix tractors, and judge when the corn was ready for harvest. Military tactics and weapons technology weren't exactly his strong suits. But Moon had something that didn't show up on any army evaluation form. He understood how things moved. Growing up on a farm, you learn physics without ever opening a textbook. You learn it by throwing hay bales up into lofts, by tossing tools to your dad across the barn, by calculating angles and distances 100 times a day without even realizing you're doing it. Lying there in the dirt with bullets cracking through the air above him, Moon studied that bunker with a farmer's practical eye. He watched how the grenades bounced off the coral, how they rolled downhill, how the smooth round shape worked against them. It was like watching someone try to throw a baseball through a window and being surprised when it bounced off the frame every single time. The grenades weren't heavy enough to punch through into the opening, and they were too spherical to catch and hold. They needed something different, something that would behave differently in the air and on impact. That morning, someone in the supply chain had made an error. It was the kind of mistake that normally would get a quartermaster chewed out, but it would turn out to be the most fortunate accident of the entire campaign. Mixed in with Moon's regular allocation of standard fragmentation grenades were 2 white phosphorus canisters. These weren't meant for what Moon was thinking about. They were marked very clearly for smoke and signaling only, used to create smoke screens or mark positions for artillery. The regulations about them were crystal clear and written in the kind of bold text that meant the army was deadly serious. Do not use offensively. Chemical weapon. Danger of severe burns. Moon pulled one of the phosphorus grenades from his webbing and hefted it in his hand. The weight difference was immediately noticeable. This thing was substantially heavier than the fragmentation models, almost twice the mass. It also had a shorter fuse, which meant less time between throwing and detonation. Less time for it to roll away or for the enemy to toss it back out. And then there was the phosphorus itself. Moon knew what white phosphorus did because they'd been briefed on it during training. It burned at temperatures that were hard to even imagine, hot enough to melt metal. It created smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And it kept burning even if you tried to put it out with water. In an open space, that was dangerous but manageable. In a confined space like a bunker, it would be absolutely catastrophic. His sergeant noticed what Moon was holding and his eyes went wide. The sergeant was a by-the-book soldier, and the book said what Moon was thinking about doing was somewhere between extremely stupid and court-martial worthy. He told Moon to put it away, told him those weren't for throwing at enemy positions, told him he'd get himself killed or worse. But Moon had done his own calculations. He'd watched 7 men from his platoon die in the last 3 days. Watched them get cut down trying to follow procedures that clearly weren't working. At some point, following the rules stopped being about discipline and started being about suicide. Moon made his decision. He pulled the pin on that white phosphorus grenade, counted off the seconds in his head, and threw with all the skill that came from years of farm work. The heavier grenade flew differently, more stable, less affected by the humid air. It didn't bounce when it hit the coral. Instead, it dropped straight down through that narrow firing slit like it was meant to be there. Moon pressed himself flat and counted. 1001, 1002, 1003. The bunker didn't explode in the traditional sense. Instead, it erupted with thick white smoke that poured from every crack and opening. Inside, the temperature instantly became incompatible with human life. The phosphorus ignited everything combustible and created an atmosphere that no one could survive in. The machine gun stopped firing. For a moment, there was just stunned silence from Moon's squad. They'd been trying to knock out that bunker for hours, and this farm kid from Iowa had just done it with a single throw of a grenade they weren't supposed to be using. Before anyone could fully process what had happened, another Japanese position opened up, trying to provide covering fire. Moon didn't hesitate. He grabbed his second phosphorus grenade, calculated the angle like he was throwing a feed bag into a loft, and sent it on its way. Same result. White smoke, silence, another bunker neutralized. The sergeant just stared at him, and then said something that would echo through the battalion by nightfall. Get me more of those things. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years. Moon moved through that section of jungle like a one-man wrecking crew, systematically taking out bunker after bunker with his unauthorized technique. The heavier weight of the phosphorus grenades meant he could throw them more accurately. The shorter fuse meant the Japanese had less time to react, and the effects of white phosphorus in an enclosed space meant that even if the defenders survived the initial blast, they couldn't stay at their posts. By early afternoon, Moon had personally cleared more enemy positions than some entire companies had managed in the previous 3 days. His unit advanced further in a few hours than they had in the entire week prior. Word spread through the division like wildfire. Soldiers talk, especially when something is working and keeping them alive. By evening, guys in other companies were asking their supply sergeants if they had any of those smoke grenades, the ones that weren't officially for smoke. Officers who had spent the last week watching their casualty reports pile up started asking questions. How was Easy Company making such good progress? What were they doing differently? The answers they got made them deeply uncomfortable because it meant everything they'd been taught, everything in the official manuals, might be wrong. Captain Winters found Moon during a brief lull in the fighting. Winters was a West Point graduate, trained in orthodox tactics and proper military procedure. He had the field manual open and was pointing to specific paragraphs that spelled out in unambiguous terms that what Moon had been doing all day was forbidden. White phosphorus grenades were classified as chemical weapons, Winters explained. Using them against personnel violated international agreements. It was the kind of thing that could lead to war crimes tribunals, or at the very least, a court-martial for everyone involved. Moon's response was simple and devastating. He pointed toward the aid station where medics were working on the wounded and asked how many of those men would still be walking around if he'd kept throwing grenades that didn't work. Winters closed his manual. He was stuck between two impossible positions. On one hand, his duty was to follow regulations and maintain discipline. On the other hand, he just watched those same regulations get his men killed for days. He made a choice that would define whether he was just another officer or a leader who understood that reality doesn't care about manuals. He told Moon he didn't see anything, but if Moon got himself killed doing this, Winters wasn't writing a letter home explaining that Moon died violating orders. Moon accepted those terms. By sunset, the numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. Moon had taken out 20 Japanese positions using methods that were explicitly forbidden. His company had advanced almost a mile, which was more than some battalions had managed all week. And most importantly, Easy Company's casualty rate had dropped to nearly zero during those assaults. Moon wasn't getting hit. His squad mates weren't getting hit. The only ones getting hurt were the Japanese defenders who couldn't survive what was happening inside their bunkers. The question was no longer whether Moon's technique worked. The question was whether the army would admit it worked. The battalion commander called a meeting. Officers crowded into a command tent that smelled like canvas and cigarette smoke, and the argument that broke out was fierce. On one side were the pragmatists, the guys who'd been watching men die and were desperate for anything that worked. On the other side were the doctrine people, the ones who'd spent their careers studying proper weapons employment, and weren't about to throw out the textbooks because of one successful day. The weapons officer was particularly adamant. He'd graduated from the Army's premier ordnance school, had studied explosives for 15 years, and he laid out in technical detail all the ways that using white phosphorus offensively was dangerous, unpredictable, and against every safety regulation for good reason. The counterargument came from the officers who'd actually been on the line. They'd tried proper technique for days, had watched it fail repeatedly, had filled out death certificates for men who died following procedures that didn't match reality. One captain asked a devastating question: how many casualties had the battalion taken trying to clear bunkers the approved way? The answer was 47 killed or wounded. How many casualties had Moon's technique caused to friendly forces? Silence. That silence was louder than any argument. The battalion commander made his decision. He ordered Moon brought to headquarters, and when the private arrived covered in mud and coral dust, still carrying his rifle and grenades, the commander asked him to explain his reasoning. Moon's explanation was simple. The standard grenades were too light and too bouncy. They didn't work. The phosphorus grenades were heavier and created conditions inside the bunkers that forced evacuation. It worked, and he'd proven it for an entire day without hurting any Americans. The commander listened, thought for a moment, and then gave an order that would save hundreds of lives but would never appear in official doctrine. Authorize white phosphorus grenades for bunker assault. Get Moon to train the squad leaders. If the Ordnance Department has a problem with it, they can court-martial me after we take this island. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Within 24 hours, every rifle company in the regiment had new tactics and new supplies. Moon spent the next day moving between units, showing squad leaders his technique. The training wasn't complicated. Pick your target. Calculate the angle. Use the heavier grenade instead of the standard one. Take cover. The results spoke for themselves. Companies that had been stuck for days suddenly started making progress. The casualty reports that had been steadily climbing started to level off, and then drop. The division's medical officers noticed they were using less morphine, less plasma, treating fewer gunshot wounds and more minor injuries. Men were coming back from patrols without being carried. The Japanese noticed immediately. Captured documents would later reveal their perspective. One officer's diary described the new American tactics with obvious fear. The enemy employs fire weapons that make our strongest positions untenable. The heat and smoke force evacuation. Men cannot maintain their posts. Another report recommended immediate withdrawal to deeper caves because the traditional defensive positions were no longer effective against these new tactics. For an army that had built its entire Pacific strategy around fortified defense, this was devastating news. The technique spread organically through the division and then beyond. Soldiers from the 41st talked to guys in other units. Supply officers noticed the sudden demand for white phosphorus grenades and started asking why. By early June, the entire Army Corps in New Guinea was using Moon's method. By August, Marines were employing the same tactics in other campaigns. The official documentation never caught up with reality. Field manuals were quietly revised with carefully worded paragraphs buried in appendices about alternative employment of smoke-producing munitions in specialized circumstances. The manuals never mentioned that a high school dropout from Iowa had solved a problem that weapons experts couldn't figure out. The decisive test came at Mockmare Airfield, the primary objective of the entire Biak campaign. The Japanese had surrounded the airfield with nearly 70 interconnected bunker positions, creating overlapping fields of fire that made approach almost suicidal. Taking those positions using conventional tactics would have been a bloodbath. But Moon's company, now trained in his methods, went through those bunkers like they were punching through paper. The assault that staff officers had estimated would take 3 days was completed in 8 hours. American casualties were remarkably light. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. The statistical analysis compiled after the campaign was damning for the old doctrine. Before Moon's innovation, the division was expending nearly 50 grenades per bunker and suffering more than 3 casualties for each position eliminated. After adopting white phosphorus for bunker work, those numbers dropped to around 2 grenades per bunker and less than 1 casualty per position. The lives saved calculation was straightforward mathematics. The division cleared over 300 bunkers during the Biak campaign. Using the old casualty rates, that should have cost around 1,000 American casualties. The actual number was less than 250. Moon's technique had saved approximately 700 American lives on a single island. Production numbers tell the real story of institutional recognition, even when official doctrine remained unchanged. In 1943, before Moon's innovation, the military produced about 2 million white phosphorus grenades for smoke and signaling. In 1944, production jumped to nearly 7 million. By 1945, production exceeded 11 million units. The procurement documents still classified them as smoke grenades, but everyone knew what they were really being used for. The Army never formally admitted that their approved doctrine had been wrong, but they sure manufactured a lot of smoke grenades for an infantry force that suddenly needed them for some mysterious reason. Moon received a Silver Star for his actions. The citation was carefully worded to describe innovative tactical employment of available resources without explicitly mentioning that he'd violated standing orders. Moon kept the medal in a drawer and never talked about it. After the war, he went back to Iowa, took over his father's farm, married his girlfriend, raised kids, and lived a quiet life. He didn't give interviews. He didn't speak at veteran events. When the local paper tried to write a hero story about him, he declined to cooperate. For Moon, what he'd done wasn't heroic. It was just obvious. Men were dying because the approved method didn't work, so he found a method that did work. The fact that it violated regulations was less important than the fact that it kept his friends alive. Decades later, at a division reunion, something happened that Moon never forgot. An elderly man approached him with tears in his eyes and introduced himself as the son of Captain Winters, Moon's company commander who had chosen to look the other way. The son explained that his father had kept a list before he died, a list of every man in Easy Company who survived the war. Winters had calculated that without Moon's technique, at least 47 of those men would have died on Biak. The captain had wanted Moon to know that he considered Moon the bravest soldier he'd ever commanded, not because Moon charged machine guns or led desperate assaults, but because Moon had the courage to be right when everyone else was following orders that were wrong. Modern military doctrine has evolved to embrace the principle Moon demonstrated. Leadership manuals now include case studies about innovation under pressure and the importance of adaptive tactics over rigid doctrine. The specific lesson is clear. Regulations exist to serve the mission, not to be served by the mission. When reality contradicts the manual, reality is usually correct. White phosphorus grenades remain in the military arsenal today, now officially recognized for multiple purposes including clearing fortified positions. Every time a modern soldier uses one to neutralize a bunker, they're employing a technique that was invented by a farm kid who had the courage to question authority when lives were at stake. Harold Moon died in 1998. His obituary mentioned his military service in passing but didn't detail what he'd actually done. There was no mention of the 20 bunkers, the 700 lives saved, or the technique that changed how the Pacific War was fought. But the lesson endures in ways that matter more than obituaries or medals. Sometimes the most important innovations come from unexpected places. They come from people without credentials, without authority, without permission. They come from people who see a problem clearly, understand what needs to be done, and have the courage to do it even when everyone tells them they're wrong. The thousands of Americans who survived the Pacific War because one private decided that saving lives mattered more than following bad regulations never knew his name. But they went home. They had families. They lived full lives. And that's a legacy that speaks louder than any official recognition ever could. Moon didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted his friends to come home alive. Sometimes that's what heroism actually looks like. Not following orders, but having the wisdom to recognize when orders are wrong and the courage to do what's right instead. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're fighting a war or just trying to solve a problem that everyone says is impossible.